Well, welcome to question 48 of the secundae. The topic for this lecture is the parts of prudence, and I am Dr. Thibault. Um, this is a kind of an intermediary question here that we have in question 48. In question 47, which we just covered, there were 16 articles, which was quite long. And this one has one article. So we went from 16 to 1. It's also an in-between stage because if you want to know about prudence, well, what is prudence? We'll look back to question 47. Uh, this is dealing with the parts of prudence, which if you want to know more about the parts of prudence, look at the questions following this. So this is both, it points backwards to 47 and forward to questions 49 through 56. So uh, again, this is a bit of a bridge question. So it's introducing the parts of prudence. So there are three parts of prudence. There's the integral, and now an integral part is something that composes it, right? Comprises it. So if you want to say what are the parts of a house, the walls, the roof, the floor, if you don't have these things, uh, you don't end up having a house, right? You can't, the house is built upon these integral parts. So prudence also has integral parts. If you don't have these parts, then you can't have prudence, right? A prudence is an empty word, right? Just like house is an empty word if it doesn't have uh, walls and roofs and floors. Then there's also the subjective uh, part of prudence, are the which are the species of prudence. So this is, for example, like an ox or a lion is part of the um, family of animals, right? So an ox is fully an animal, right? A lion is also fully an animal, but an ox is not a lion, and a lion is not an ox. Well, this is different than the integral parts because a wall is not fully a house. A roof is not fully a house. A floor is not fully a house. It actually requires an additive measure of the different integral parts in order to create the house. This is different and subjective because uh, they are not dependent, they are subjective, but they are subjects to the class of animals. And they are not dependent on one another, unlike the integral parts. So these are species, right? And this is, if you're familiar with species of animals, it's the same thing. They are parts of a family. Now there are the potential parts of prudence. Now this one is more complicated to describe in the abstract um, because the example St. Thomas gives is the nutritive and the sensitive powers of the soul. Well, if you are new to Thomistic and Aristotelian language, that doesn't help much probably. In some ways, it is similar to the subjective in some ways, and in somewhat it is similar to the integral parts, right? A soul is not truly a soul if it doesn't have any type of parts to it, right? Whether it's a vegetative or uh, animated or sensitive, right? There has to be some part of the soul for it to be useful. Uh, but it's also not in and of itself necessary. So, and all oxes are animals, but when we look to the subordinate parts of the secondary effects, things like good counsel is a potential part of prudence. Well, good counsel is not prudence. Right? It's not prudence in and of itself, the way ox is an animal in and of itself. It's also not uh, additive, right? Another example of a potential part of prudence would be gnome, which is used in uh, for exceptions to the rule. That's not necessary in every act of prudence, whereas in every house you need to have a floor and a roof and a wall, right? So integral parts are necessary. Potential parts are not necessary, but they can be used, right? They're secondary elements. I'm not sure if that's helpful, but we're going to also break them down again in this lecture, and then we're going to get into them in future questions. So if you still don't get it, that is okay, but maybe this has helped a little bit. When we look at the integral parts of justice, again, this is like the walls and the roof and the floor. Um, they are things which need to concur for the perfect act of virtue. So they're necessary for to be perfectly called the virtue, which in this case is prudence. So there are 8 integral parts of prudence. Um, these 8 parts are also broken into 3 sections. So I've indicated these 3 sections with these 3 different degrees of color. So for somebody to be prudent, there has to be some degree of memory, which would be knowledge of the past. If you don't have any type of knowledge of the past, it's hard to have prudence, right? Because how do you know what might be coming if you don't know what has since come in the past? Also, understanding, which St. Thomas defines as knowledge of the present. How can you be prudent about what is to come if you don't know where you are currently, right? That's very difficult. So the past and the present are necessary for prudence. You can't be completely ignorant of the past and present and still be prudent, right? Prudence deals with seeing what's coming down the road, seeing what, being prepared for what is coming ahead. How do you know what's coming ahead if you don't know the past and the present? Now, the second group is ways of knowing. Right? So docility, which St. Thomas defines as knowledge from teaching, right? And then shrewdness is knowledge from discovery. So you have either experienced something which has given you knowledge, right? That shrewdness, uh, experiential, or you've learned from others, right? That's docility, learning from others. Um, so that would be ways of knowing. And then lastly, uh, reason. So this deals with, in some sense, the command part of prudence. And it's the use of knowledge, right? So you might have knowledge of the past and present. You may have gained it through somebody teaching you, or you have experienced it yourself. But now, can you put it to good use, right? Now that you have that, can you use your reason to make good decisions? Now, there's 3 elements of this. So there's 3 sections, but within this third section, the last 3 are kind of subparts of reason. So foresight, uh, order that which befits an end is necessary. So if you have good reason, you use knowledge, you should be able to say, well, if I want to be successful in school, I need to go to bed at a reasonable hour. I need to wake up early. I need to be prepared for class. I need to go to class. I need to be awake in class. I need to participate in class. Right? These are ordering things which befits the end. Right? You have to put them in the proper ordering, in the right way. You have to have foresight to know I have to go to bed tonight so that I will be well rested for tomorrow. I need to do my homework today so I will be prepared for class tomorrow. Right? There's some level of foresight. You can't just be in class and say, oh, I should have done my homework because I don't know what's going on. Well, foresight would have been key, right? That's dealing with prudence, and that's using your knowledge to be prepared for the future. Also, circumspection, which is aware of your circumstances, right? That's rather straightforward. Dealing with how do you use your past, present knowledge, your experience. You have to be able to be aware of where you are and what are the circumstances, right? Because prudence is dealing with specifics, right? It's dealing with individuals in specific situations, not generalizations. It's not dealing with universals. It's dealing with specifics. Circumstances matter when dealing with specifics. And then lastly, caution, which is to avoid obstacles, right? And that really is a big part of prudence. The way I think of it is like if you're driving, for example, I brought this up last question to question 47, but a prudent person driving is looking ahead. They're looking ahead in the road. They're using their past experience to say that's a dangerous intersection up ahead. It's kind of a blind road, and people can kind of just pull out on you because they can't see you coming. So you have to be aware of that. Well, my experience is that children are irrational and might run into the road. So if you see a child on the side of the road, you slow down because you don't know what they might do, right? Or a dog, for example, right? A dog might just walk in the road. So if you see a dog up ahead, you kind of slow down. So caution is to avoid obstacles. But how do you know to do this? Well, dealing with your past experience, your present experience, maybe a story somebody told you about hitting an animal on the side of the road or dangerous intersection, um, your own experience of having done this before, being aware of your circumstances, um, and putting your priorities straight in the proper ordering, right? These all work together in terms of prudence. These are pieces of your house to be a prudent person. Now, there are subjective parts of prudence, which are the species again, right? So in each of these are truly prudence in and of themselves in some way, right? Military prudence is prudence. Political prudence is prudence, just like an ox is an animal, a lion is an animal. They're not contingent upon one another, and they're not integral to one another. They don't build on one another. They are fully prudence, but military prudence is not the same as domestic prudence. So they're different types of prudence, but they are both fully prudence. So these are subjective parts of prudence. So military prudence is the ability to govern an army, quite obvious. No offense to any of the Navy and Air Force people at the time. St. Thomas just said army. Clearly, there was not an Air Force at the time that St. Thomas was writing, but perhaps there was a Navy. Um, there was also domestic prudence, which is the ability to govern your family. Uh, Regnative prudence, which spell check doesn't even know that word, so probably not that common, but it is governing a city or a kingdom, governing in a political sense. And this is different than number 4, political prudence, which if you remember back from question 47, it was defined a little bit differently. So question 47, it was proper governance of a city. But now St. Thomas is calling that regnative prudence. This political prudence is of subjects. So uh, if you are an individual within a society, how are you prudent towards your relationship as a member of that society? That's another form of prudence. How to be neighborly, how to be properly governed, right? Uh, the art being properly governed is probably an art form which is also lost. And typically, they'll fall into the form of just obedience or rebellion. But proper prudence in being governed, being a neighbor is important. Again, all of these we go into much more detail in the future. So if you feel like you still want to know more, watch a future video. They'll be in there. Prudence in terms of speculative knowledge. Now, prudence is not generally focused on speculative knowledge. It's mostly deals with practical reason, right? Right action is where it stands. But it also can be useful to speculative knowledge, although it is not primarily used for speculative knowledge. It's primarily used in terms of a moral virtue, but it's used in speculative knowledge. Okay. And it's particularly yet necessary in the sciences. The first is in terms of physics. So attaining science by demonstration. So any type of science that deals with being able to repeat activities and to show some type of empirical knowledge would be under the topic of physics. Well, this is true when we think of memory and understanding, right? You know, if you drop a ball from the top of a building, it will fall at a particular speed at the same, same velocity every time, right? You can calculate it, depending on wind, it might change, but considering it's windless, right? You can calculate um, the velocity. Well, your memory can tell you, well, it did that 100 times, right? Uh, it did it 100 times. So on the 101 time, what's the likelihood that it's going to be the same? Very likely, right? Because our memory has taught us that. So prudence is being able to predict the future in science too, right? Uh, if something is repeatable, right? We can know it by science, right? Science, actually, the physical sciences wouldn't work without some degree of being able to predict, right? How could you ever have a hypothesis or um, to do any type of experimentation if you didn't first have a reasonable hypothetical, which was based on an understanding and memory of what works. Um, can't be random every time, right? So very important, prudence. There would be no science without prudence. Um, Also dialectics, which is to arrive at an opinion through probable premises. Again, very similar to what I was just talking about, right? If you can't repeat something, if something isn't repeatable, you can't make it predictable, right? And if you have that understanding, you can probable premises. You can come up with hypotheticals and that dialectic. And lastly, rhetoric. So, if somebody has a belief in something, is there any suspicion to it, right? Or could you persuade someone through rhetoric? Well, again, that takes knowledge, right? The people who have the best opinions on television, on terms of politics, I think are people who have a good memory, right? Not their own memory, but maybe they're well read. Right? They're people who have experience and they have read and they've been taught. Uh, um, these are people who have a good knowledge. They can say, well, back in 1929, this happened. Therefore, it's similar to this that's happening today. Well, that's more interesting than say, well, my opinion is this versus my opinion is that. Well, based on what, right? Experience, some type of teaching that you've had, some type of memory, some type of understanding, based on what, right? What is the reason? So rhetoric really requires prudence as well. Um, well, good rhetoric does anyway. Now there are the potential parts of prudence. And this one I said was the most difficult to explain because it's a little bit of both in some sense. So potential parts of virtues are connected with it. Potential parts are virtues connected with it, not having the whole power of the principal virtue. That's true of all parts. All parts are not the whole power. But I think that when you see the examples, it makes sense. So the three potential parts of prudence are good counsel, which can't really give a definition of good counsel because it means good counsel, right? Being able to listen to good advice. Um, then synesis is the next one, which is one of these Greek terms, which means judgment in ordinary occurrences, so proper judgment. These terms are used often in legal studies, right? In the theory of law, these things come up. There are scholarly articles in law journals dealing with synesis and no these ideas. So they're not dead ideas. They are used even today. Um, so good judgment based on ordinary experiences and norm, which is judgment in matters of exceptions to the law. And both of these are necessary in order to have good justice, right? But this comes from prudence. So in terms of synesis, you know, judgment in ordinary occurrences is important because, well, if one person is tried for shoplifting and they get 30 days in jail for shoplifting, and the next person comes up to the bench and they're also guilty of shoplifting, and you give them 3 months in jail, and somebody else comes up for shoplifting, they have 1 year in jail. Um, well, this is not good judgment because in the same situation, you've given three different punishments to three different people. That's not consistent. It's not good judgment. Good judgment would have a level of consistency to it and predictability and due process, right? That this would make for synesis. Now, no is for exceptions to the law. So, if somebody, three people were guilty of shoplifting, and it turns out, well, one of these people was a teenager, and another one was a drug addict, and uh, another one was somebody very poor, and they were stealing to feed their family. Well, that you would treat these three situations slightly differently would make some sense. You might say, well, the general rule on the situation would be X, but because you're so young, well, we want to put you on the right path, so we want to make sure that you don't go down the wrong path, but we also don't want a criminal record on we don't want you to have a criminal record because then that might ruin your entire future over a keychain from Spencer Gifts or something like that, right? We don't want you to be now unemployable and unable to join the military or who knows what in the future because of a stupid keychain that you made that decision about in your youth. That would be a good exception to the law. I don't know what the proper punishment should be, but you should take into consideration those exceptions. And then, if a person is a drug addict and they do it, you should also consider that differently, right? The person may have some level of involuntariness and desperation. Well, if a person is poor and they steal food to feed their family, it might not be a sin at all, or maybe wrong at all, right? There's exceptions to these rules. So the gnome is very important, right, in terms of not letting justice um, become injustice, right? If you send a person to jail for a year because they tried to steal food to feed their family, um, maybe this isn't as relevant in the United States where we have so many social programs, but if you steal food to feed your family and now you get thrown in jail for a year, your family will starve even more. This did not actually perform justice, right? So to keep justice from becoming injustice, you need things like no, you need exceptions to the rule so that justice is truly just. This is also true of epikeia, which we study in the topic of justice, which is equity. Right? It's not everything being treated perfectly as equal, but in its proper, in the way in which best brings out justice. So this is, again, we're going to get into this more, but these are potential parts of prudence. I will point out, we don't call good counsel prudence. We don't call gnome prudence. They aren't prudence in themselves. Gnome is gnome. Good counsel is good counsel. But they are, and not every issue of justice deals with gnome. Not every issue of justice deals with uh, synesis, right? So they are potentially used. Right? They are in the tool belt of things to be used to be prudent, but they aren't used every time. Um, they aren't really prudent in and of themselves. They're more secondary. So in conclusion, now this is a relief to look at only one thing on this screen compared to question 47. where there were 16 of them. There are three distinct parts of prudence, really, and that's it. That was the question, is there? And the answer is yes. There are three parts, but there are many subparts, which we will get into individually. So that's it for this question. I will see you next time when we get into the integral parts, quasi-integral parts of justice.